The first time Karen from the HOA called 911 on me, you'd have thought I was some fugitive hiding in the mountains instead of a man sitting on his own porch. The wail of sirens tore through the valley just after sunrise, rattling the morning calm like a war drum. 3 squad cars bounced up my gravel drive, dust clouds trailing behind them like smoke from a battlefield. And there she was, Karen Whitfield, 50-something, bleached hair, fire engine lipstick smeared on the rim of a stainless steel thermos. She stepped out of her Lexus like she was storming a boardroom, pointing manicured claws at me as if she were summoning the cavalry. "Officer!" "Arrest him. He's trespassing on HOA property." Her voice cracked through the pine-scented air, sharp enough to make the blue jays scatter from the trees. I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even put down the chipped enamel mug of black, coffee warming my hand. Steam curled from it, mingling with the faint smoke of last night's campfire. My rocking chair creaked under me, wood groaning like an old friend that had seen this dance before. The officers spread out across my front yard, boots crunching pine needles, radios buzzing. But the sheriff, he froze when he saw me. Because this wasn't just some cabin squatter. This was me, John Carter. A man whose family name had been etched into the very foundation of this land for over 100 years. And the sheriff knew it. Everyone in this county knew it. Karen, though, didn't. Or maybe she just didn't care. To her, I wasn't a man with a legacy. I was an eyesore blocking the picture-perfect marketing brochure she wanted to sell to every out-of-towner gullible enough to buy into mountain luxury living. I reached into my flannel pocket, slow, deliberate, like a gunslinger ready to draw. Pulled out a folded document, edges browned, paper brittle as dried leaves. The sheriff's eyes tracked it before it even opened. He knew. "This," I said, holding it steady, "is the original county charter, signed, sealed, and recorded. My family owns every acre you're standing on, including the one Karen Whitfield's HOA is so proud of." The words cut deeper than a chainsaw, diesel fumes from the squad cars mixed with Karen's perfume, but neither could mask the scent of panic that rolled off her in waves. She blinked, hard, lips twitching like she'd just swallowed glass. Her $1 million subdivision, built on my family's land, her pristine cul-de-sacs, paved over my grandfather's hunting grounds, and the cabin she wanted me evicted from? It wasn't. Some squatter's shack. It was the cornerstone of this county. But here's the thing about people like Karen. When faced with truth, they don't retreat. They reload. That morning was only the beginning. She wasn't going to stop until she broke me, or thought she had. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just a man in a rocking chair with an old deed. I was the legal owner of every square foot of this county, and I had the paperwork, the history, and the iron will to prove it. So let me back up, because before the flashing lights and Karen's shrill voice filled my valley, before she sicked the sheriff on me, and long before the HOA declared war on my bloodline, I was just a man coming home. Coming home to a cabin that carried the smell of cedar, smoke, the sound of creeks carving through stone, and the weight of generations who refused to bend. And that's when Karen decided her rules mattered more than history itself. The subdivision Karen called her kingdom rose like a scar across the valley floor. Gated entrances, cookie-cutter houses, in muted shades of beige, manicured lawns trimmed to regulation height, every blade of grass calculated to look identical to the next. It was a machine disguised as a neighborhood, and Karen was the engine. The HOA board meetings were her throne room. She spoke, and her subjects obeyed. Want to paint your shutters navy instead of approved hunter green? Denied, think you. Can park your truck in your own driveway? Fined. Even Christmas lights had to be white. No color allowed. No individuality. No rebellion. But then came my wife, Emily. She wasn't the type to pick fights. She was the type to grow tomatoes on the back porch, hum old folk songs under her breath, and smile at neighbors even when they scowled back. But when Karen's letter arrived, threatening us with a $500 fine for unauthorized structures, meaning the porch swing I built for Emily by hand, my wife laughed, and then she ignored it. That laugh, that shrug, that deliberate act of dismissal. It drove Karen mad. To her, ignoring the HOA wasn't just non-compliance, it was mutiny, and Karen never tolerated mutiny. The second letter came a week later. Triple the fine, signed in ink so aggressive the pen nearly tore the page. Emily placed it under a wobbly table leg in the kitchen. Problem solved. By the third letter, Karen had worked herself into a frenzy. She started calling the house late at night, her number blocked, breathing sharp into the receiver before hanging up. She marched across the property line uninvited, snapping photos of our garden, our firewood stack, even the clothesline where Emily's dresses swayed in the mountain breeze. But nothing lit the fuse like the fourth letter. This one wasn't delivered by mail. It came with sirens, because Karen had done the unthinkable. She called the police, not for trespassing, not for noise, but for ignoring an HOA fine. It was absurd, laughable even. Except when 3 squad cars arrived, it stopped being funny. This time. Emily stood beside me on the porch as the sheriff climbed out. Karen was already there, pacing like a general before battle, rehearsing her victory speech. Her eyes gleamed with a dangerous mix of self-righteousness and desperation. The sheriff approached, hand resting lightly on his holster. His deputies hung back, unsure. The mountain air crackled with tension, birds silent, even the wind holding its breath. Karen jabbed her finger toward Emily. "She's the one! She's refusing to comply with HOA law. Fine her, arrest her if you must." Her words rang across the valley, absurd yet dripping with venom. And that's when it happened. "Tianta." Sheriff turned, really looked at Emily, and froze. His mouth opened, then shut again. A recognition flashed in his eyes, one that cut through Karen's shrieking like a hot knife. Slowly, he lowered his hand from his holster, shoulders squaring as if bracing for something heavy. "Ma'am," he said, voice careful. "Your name?" Emily spoke softly, but with steel beneath it, and when she did, the sheriff's face drained of color. Because this wasn't just any woman standing on that porch. This was the Honorable Judge Emily Carter. Retired, yes, but once one of the most respected circuit judges in the entire state. A woman whose gavel had struck fear into corrupt politicians and hardened criminals alike. And now she was standing here, accused by a suburban tyrant of ignoring a swing-set fine. The sheriff removed his hat, holding it against his chest, eyes lowered in respect. Karen's smile faltered. What she had unleashed wasn't a petty squabble anymore. It was about to become a reckoning. Because if there's one, thing worse than crossing a Carter in this county, it's crossing a Carter who used to wear the robe, and Karen had no idea what storm she had just summoned. The moment stretched like glass, fragile and razor-thin. The sheriff stood there, hat in hand, bowing not to authority, but to history. Every deputy behind him shifted uneasily, unsure of whether to treat this like a domestic disturbance or a courtroom proceeding brought to life. Karen, however, wasn't wired to sense danger. Not the real kind. She still thought she was winning. "Judge?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "She's nobody now, retired, irrelevant, living here like the rest of us. HOA rules apply to everyone, especially her." But what Karen didn't understand was simple. Titles may fade, but respect doesn't. Not here. Not in this county. The sheriff didn't even glance at Karen. His focus remained on Emily. "Ma'am," he said, steady. "I was in your courtroom once, 12 years ago. You gave me a chance no one else would have." Emily's expression softened. She remembered. A young man in uniform, charged after a bar fight, standing at a crossroads. She had sentenced him to probation, community service, and counseling instead of jail. a decision that had changed the trajectory of his life. That man was now the sheriff. Karen's face reddened. She could see the ground shifting under her feet but had no idea how to stop it. Her voice climbed into hysteria. "Are you blind? She's defying the HOA. That's criminal negligence. You have to enforce the law." But that was the fatal mistake. Because the sheriff finally turned toward her, his patience drained. His voice carried the weight of authority and memory. "Ma'am, HOA bylaws aren't criminal law. They're civil. And civil disputes don't involve police unless trespass or threats are made. You've wasted county resources, called in officers under false pretenses, and trespassed on private property yourself." The deputies shifted, waiting for Karen's reaction. But Karen wasn't done. No, she doubled down. She always doubled down. "You don't understand," she hissed. "If you let her get away with this, the whole community falls apart. People need order. They need rules. Without them, we're animals." The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Here she was, screeching like a zealot, while the so-called rule breaker stood calm, dignified, untouchable. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply looked Karen in the eye with that same stare she'd once used on defendants who thought they could outwit the court. A stare that said, "I've seen worse than you, and worse than you have all fallen." The sheriff nodded to his deputies. "Document this, every detail. I'll be filing a report with the county prosecutor's office." Karen blinked, caught between disbelief and fury. This wasn't the script she had written in her mind. She had expected handcuffs on Emily. Instead, she felt the invisible grip of accountability tightening around her own wrists. Emily finally spoke, voice low but firm. "I'll be handling this my way." Karen laughed, but it rang hollow. "And what's that supposed to mean?" But Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because when a judge says she'll handle it, that isn't a threat. It's a verdict waiting to be written. The deputies finished their notes. The sheriff tipped his hat once more in respect. And as the squad cars pulled away, leaving Karen sputtering in the driveway, one truth crystallized. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was about to become a courtroom battle, and Karen had just declared war on someone who wrote the rules she thought she understood. Karen didn't sleep that night. Her blinds snapped open and shut as she kept watch, convinced Emily was plotting against her. The HOA president's emails burned through the community inbox, dripping with venom. "If one person ignores fines, the rest will follow. This is the end of order." But the neighborhood wasn't convinced anymore. Whispers spread over fences and across lawns. For the first time, residents began questioning whether Karen's crusade was really about rules or control. And Emily, she was unshaken. Her mornings remained unchanged. A cup of coffee on the porch, her golden retriever at her side, and that quiet dignity of someone who'd faced bigger storms than this. She didn't retaliate with words. She didn't need to, because her battlefield wasn't the cul-de-sac. It was the courthouse. The very next week, Karen received a thick envelope stamped with legal insignia. Her face turned white as she ripped it open. Inside was a notice. Emily had filed a civil action against her for harassment, trespass, and abuse of law enforcement resources. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a masterstroke. Emily had done what she had always done best, turned raw conflict into a matter of record. And on paper, Karen's behavior wasn't righteous. It was reckless. Neighbors who once feared Karen's wrath began stepping back. One couple, weary of her midnight rants about community decay, stopped showing up to HOA meetings. Another quietly confided to Emily, "We've had enough." Someone needed to stand up to her. Still, Karen pressed on. She printed flyers, taped them to mailboxes, warning that Emily was corrupting the neighborhood. She banged on doors, demanding signatures for a petition to remove Emily from the community. Even though Emily wasn't on the board, it was desperation, and it showed. Meanwhile, the sheriff's deputies were building their case too. The incident, report from that night, complete with Karen's meltdown captured on body cameras, was now in the hands of the county prosecutor, and Emily knew exactly how this would end. Not with shouting. Not with screaming, but with a gavel strike, cold and final. By the time the HOA gathered for its next monthly meeting, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Residents filled the small clubhouse, eyes darting between Karen's flushed face and Emily's calm composure. Karen stood, clutching her binder of rules like scripture. She launched into a tirade about law, order, and the collapse of civilization if fines weren't respected. But then Emily rose, slowly, quietly, and the room fell silent. She didn't bring a binder. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid the lawsuit paperwork on the table. The words, Plaintiff Emily Harper, stamped across the top, froze the air. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances. For years, they had tolerated Karen's fire because it kept the neighborhood in line. But now it was clear. She wasn't protecting order. She was dismantling it. One by one, neighbors began to turn. And for the first time in years, Karen wasn't the voice of authority. She was the warning sign of what happens when power corrodes. But this wasn't the breaking point yet. That moment was still coming. The day Karen would step into a courtroom and realize the law she worshipped wasn't hers to wield anymore. The courthouse steps were colder than the morning air. Reporters gathered outside, tipped off by whispers that this wasn't just another petty HOA spat. It was a case of power, abuse, and humiliation unraveling in front of the law. Karen arrived first, binder clutched like a shield, her lips pressed into a tight line. She still believed this was her chance to prove herself, to show the world that she was right all along. That she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was the rules. But when Emily walked in, everything shifted. She wasn't in casual jeans on her porch anymore. She was in black robes, her judge's badge pinned just beneath her shoulder. She wasn't just a homeowner defending herself. She was a woman who had spent her career upholding justice. And today, justice was aimed directly at Karen. The courtroom buzzed when the bailiff announced her title. Whispers rippled across the rows. She's a judge? All this time? Karen's face drained of color. The binder slipped slightly from her grip. The IT officer who had hesitated that night in her driveway was now seated in the witness stand, his testimony steady and damning. He described how Karen had manipulated 911, attempted to weaponize the police, and turned a civil fine into a criminal spectacle. And then came the neighbors. One after another, they testified about the flyers, the late-night rants, the intimidation, the constant barrage of control. The weight of it stacked higher and higher, while Karen shrank smaller and smaller behind her fortress of rules. By the time Emily's attorney laid the final piece of evidence on the table, the body cam footage from that night, the courtroom was silent. On the screen, Karen's shrill voice echoed, ordering officers to arrest her, while Emily stood calm, collected, unshaken. When the lights came back on, there was no saving face. The judge presiding over the case leaned forward, her voice steady as stone. She called Karen's actions what they truly were: harassment, abuse of process, and reckless endangerment of community trust. The ruling was swift. Karen was ordered to pay damages, stripped of her position on the HOA board, and issued a restraining order preventing her from approaching Emily or any other resident under threat of arrest. The gavel struck once, and with it, years of unchecked power shattered. Karen left the courthouse that day without her binder, without her authority, and without the army of neighbors she once controlled. Emily, on the other hand, walked out into the sunlight with something far more valuable than victory. She had restored balance, not just for herself, but for every quiet neighbor who had lived under the weight of Karen's tyranny. From that day forward, the neighborhood changed. Lawns weren't perfect. Mailboxes weren't measured to the inch. But for the first time in a long time, the community breathed easy, and every morning, Emily returned to her porch with her coffee, her dog, and the calm certainty that true authority doesn't come from shouting the loudest or wielding rules like weapons. It comes from standing steady, even when the storm rages loudest, and in the end, it comes from justice itself.